They say that every story of faith begins with a fall, and that before glory, there is always a crack, a moment when the soul breaks and nothing is ever the same again. Before being an apostle, before being a rock, Peter was a man, a fisherman from the north, used to the wind, to exhaustion, and to nights where the silence of the sea weighed more than dreams. He lived among broken nets, the smell of salt, and moons reflected over waters that never promised anything. His life was simple, but in his eyes there was something that the world did not see. A waiting, a question without a name, hidden behind his strength. He did not know it, but during the days of his routine, heaven was already watching him. Sometimes, when the waves hit too hard and the nets came back empty, Peter stayed looking at the horizon, like someone searching for something he could not understand. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe an intuition, the feeling that his story was about to change forever. And then, on an ordinary day, the rumor spread through Galilee. They said that a man spoke like no one else, that his voice healed, that his words made sleeping hearts tremble. Peter heard the name among the murmurs of the port, Jesus of Nazareth, and without knowing why, he felt an impulse inside, as if the wind spoke to him for the first time. That day, he did not imagine that this voice would ask him for something that no fisherman would ever have accepted. Follow me. From that moment on, his life became a fire. He believed without understanding. He walked without looking back. And in the middle of his enthusiasm, he did not see the weight of the path he was beginning. Because believing in Jesus was not only leaving the nets, it was leaving fear, pride, and control. And Peter did not yet know how to do that. They say that true love is not measured by words, but by what one is capable of losing. And Peter, without knowing it, would lose everything: his strength, his security, his voice, until only his naked soul remained before a gaze that would love him even after denying him. But that would come later. First would come the bright days, the miracles, the laughter by the fire, the multiplied loaves, the promises of eternity. And in the middle of that joy, a shadow was hiding, patient, waiting for its moment, because every apostle keeps a secret, and Peter's was this: he wanted to love more than his fear allowed him. That contradiction would be his ruin, and his salvation. Join me on this journey, because what you are going to hear is not only the story of a man who fell 3 times, but the story of all those who once promised to be faithful and failed. The story of those who cried for their mistake and found in forgiveness a new way to love. And if you ever felt that you betrayed what you believed in, that fear made you deny what you loved the most, then this story is also yours. Subscribe and stay until the end, because you may discover that falls are not the end of the road, but the beginning of the miracle. The sun rose slowly over the Sea of Galilee, coloring the water with shades of gold and copper. Peter was there, as every morning, checking his nets with the patience of someone who has repeated the same gesture thousands of times. The sound of the water hitting the wood of the boat was his daily prayer. He didn't know how to pray with words, but he understood the language of silence. Each knot, each rope, each fish that slipped through his hands was part of his secret conversation with God, even though he still didn't know his name. Peter's hands were rough, but inside, his heart was a battlefield. He wanted to believe, he wanted to hope, but life had taught him not to trust too much in miracles. His character was strong, impulsive, stubborn. If he loved intensely. If he doubted with all his being. Perhaps that was why heaven had chosen him, because behind his roughness there was a faith that only needed to catch fire. That morning, the air smelled different. The lake seemed to hold a strange silence, as if it were waiting for something. Peter cast his nets again and again, but nothing. Not a single fish. The other fishermen murmured their frustration, but he, without knowing why, did not give up. Deep inside, something told him that this emptiness had a purpose. He looked toward the horizon. In the distance, through the mist that was beginning to rise, he saw a figure standing on the shore. At first he thought it was a traveler, a prophet, maybe a madman. But when that voice called him by his name, something inside him broke. It was a voice unlike any other. It did not command. It did not shout. It was gentle and firm, as if it spoke from within his own soul. Simon, son of Jonah. No one had ever called him that way, with such tenderness and authority at the same time. Peter let the net fall and the water splashed at his feet. He didn't understand what was happening, but he felt that this moment was worth more than all the years he had lived. The stranger climbed into his boat and asked him for something absurd, to row out into the deep. Peter, tired, frustrated, with his nets empty, hesitated for a moment. But there was something in that gaze that he couldn't resist. He obeyed. Suddenly the sea was filled with life. The fish came up from the depths, as if the very ocean wanted to surrender before that man. Peter fell to his knees, trembling. "Depart from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man," and that was where it all began. Jesus did not turn him away. On the contrary, he looked at him with compassion that burned. "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be a fisher of men." That phrase changed him forever. Peter didn't fully understand it, but his heart had already decided. He left the boat, the nets, the past, and followed that man, not because he understood what was going to happen, but because, for the first time in his life, he felt he had found what he had always sought without knowing it. A reason to love without measure. Sometimes, the greatest miracles do not happen in the heavens, but in the soul that decides to answer a voice. Peter didn't know that this "follow me" would lead him to the most glorious and the most painful moments of his life. But in that instant, as the wind blew over the lake, everything else stopped mattering. From that day on, Peter was never the same. He left the shore of the lake and everything he had known, as if the past had dissolved into the water. Beside Jesus, he discovered a world that seemed impossible. He walked among the sick who were healed just by hearing his voice, among crowds that pressed forward to touch the edge of his cloak. Peter didn't understand how he did it, but he believed everything. He watched him act with a mixture of wonder and fear, as someone witnessing something that does not belong to this world. He was a witness of the divine, and yet he remained profoundly human. At night, when weariness fell upon the group, Peter stayed silent, staring at the embers of the fire. He thought about his former life, about the nets he had left behind, and wondered if he was truly prepared to follow a man who spoke of the kingdom of God as if it were already here. He admired him, yes, but he also confused him. Jesus spoke of loving one's enemies, of forgiving 70 times 7, of turning the other cheek. And Peter, with his strong will and his pride, did not always understand. His faith was intense, but it was not yet deep. Sometimes, his impulsiveness made him rush ahead. When Jesus asked the disciples who they thought he was, Peter answered without hesitation, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." That confession, born from the heart, was the beginning of his destiny. Jesus looked at him with tenderness and authority. "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." No one had ever received such great words. Peter felt heaven open above him. For a moment he believed he had understood his mission. But faith, when it is fed by pride, becomes fragile. It didn't take long for his other side to appear. When Jesus announced that he would have to suffer and die, Peter took him aside and said firmly, "That will never happen to you." He thought he was protecting his master, but he did not understand that, in truth, he was opposing the divine plan. Jesus looked at him with a mixture of sadness and sternness. "Get behind me, Satan, for you do not understand the things of God, but those of men." Those words wounded him deeply. Peter felt his heart sink, not because Jesus rejected him, but because, for the first time, he saw himself clearly. Strong on the outside, but weak on the inside. He wanted to be faithful, but he still didn't know how. Even so, he did not give up. He followed every step, every teaching, every miracle. He saw him give sight to the blind, raise the paralyzed, embrace the sinners. And every time Jesus spoke of love and forgiveness, Peter felt something within him resist. He knew he believed, but he did not yet understand the price of believing. One night, after a long day, he approached Jesus and asked, "Lord, how many times must I forgive my brother if he sins against me? 7 times?" Jesus looked at him with that calmness that disarmed all pride and answered, "I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times 7. Peter didn't answer. In silence, he understood that following the Son of God was not a matter of strength, but of surrender. What Peter did not yet know was that life itself would make him live that lesson in his own flesh. That one day, it would not be him who offered forgiveness, but the one who begged for it, with tears. And that his fall would not be the end of his story, but the place where the love of God would become more real than ever. That night, the sky seemed to tear open above the lake. Lightning fell like knives, and the wind roared against the boat. The disciples struggled to stay afloat as the waves struck with fury. Peter, his hands clinging to the rudder, shouted orders that the wind carried away. They had sailed many times before, but this storm was not like the others. It was as if the sea itself wanted to test their faith. Darkness covered everything. There was no moon, no horizon, only water and fear. And then, among the crash of thunder, someone saw him. A figure was walking on the water. The men screamed, thinking it was a ghost. Peter felt the blood freeze in his veins. But that voice, rising above the chaos, pierced through him like lightning. "Do not be afraid. It is I." Peter's heart began to race. It was impossible, but it was him. The same one who had multiplied the loaves, the one who spoke with the authority of heaven. Peter hesitated for a moment, then shouted, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." The silence seemed to still the wind, and Jesus answered with a single word, "Come." Peter looked at his companions, who watched him in terror. He stepped out of the boat, and the world stopped. For a second, the sea held him. He felt the water beneath his feet, soft and firm, as if the abyss itself had become a path. He took another step, and another. Jesus waited for him ahead, calm, illuminated by flashes of lightning. But then, the wind roared again, and Peter looked away. Fear entered like poison. The water that had held him began to swallow him. "Lord, save me," he cried. Jesus reached out his hand and took hold of him before the sea could drag him down. His gaze was not one of reproach, but of sadness and tenderness. "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" The waves calmed. The wind ceased. Everything fell silent. Peter, soaked and trembling, clung to the hand that had saved him. He said nothing. He couldn't. His breath was a sigh between tears and awe. When they returned to the boat, the others looked at him without words. They had seen fear, but they had also seen the miracle. And Peter, while the water dripped from his robe, understood something he would never forget. Faith is not walking on water, but continuing to walk even when you begin to sink. That night, while the others slept exhausted, Peter kept his eyes on the Master, who rested in silence. His mind could not understand what had happened, but his heart could. He had felt the power of heaven and the weight of fear in the same instant, and he understood that his life would always be lived between those two waters, the water of the miracle and the water of doubt. From then on, every time he looked at the sea, he remembered that moment, the wind on his face, the voice that called him, and the hand that did not let him fall. It was the first time he fell, but it would not be the last. Since that day on the sea, Peter no longer looked at Jesus the same way. He had felt, on his own skin, the boundary between faith and fear, and he knew that this man was not just a teacher. He was something greater, more real than the very wind itself. Yet the more he followed him, the more confused he became. Jesus spoke of the kingdom with words no one fully understood. The last would be first. The poor would inherit the earth. Those who weep would be comforted. Peter nodded, but within him still beat a human desire. He wanted to see him triumph. He dreamed of a kingdom on earth, of visible justice, of glory. Sometimes as they walked along the dusty roads of Judea, Peter would watch how Jesus stopped before the sick, the children, the despised. He embraced them all, unafraid of getting stained. That puzzled Peter. "Lord," he said, "why do you waste time with those people? They can't give you anything." Jesus looked at him and smiled with that calmness that disarmed all resistance, and answered, "Peter, where the world sees no value, there lies the treasure of the Father." Peter stayed silent, but inside him a battle was raging. He loved Jesus sincerely, but he still didn't understand his language. He saw his power and wanted to protect him, like someone protecting a sacred flame from the wind. That's why, when Jesus began to speak openly about his death, about the cross and the betrayal, Peter felt something inside him rebel. "No, Lord, that must never happen to you. I will not allow it." His voice was firm, almost desperate. He wanted to save him, but he didn't understand that the Master didn't need salvation. He needed companionship in sacrifice. Then Jesus looked at him with an intensity that pierced him like lightning. "Get behind me, Satan, for you do not understand the things of God, but those of men." Those words shattered him. Peter stepped back, his heart burning, not with anger, but with pain. He couldn't understand why the one he loved most wounded him so deeply. What he didn't know was that Jesus wasn't rejecting him. He was purifying him. That night, by the fire, Peter remembered the Master's gaze. There was no hatred in it, only a deep sadness. The sadness of one who loves someone who is not yet ready to love as he loves. In silence, Peter understood that following Jesus was not about fighting for his glory, but about learning to die with him. But his human heart still resisted. In the days that followed, he tried to prove his loyalty. He was the first to speak, the first to act, the first to defend. When others doubted, he raised his voice. "I will never abandon you." And in those words, without knowing it, he planted the seed of his fall. Because sometimes when we believe our faith is unbreakable, it is precisely then that it becomes most fragile. Jesus knew it. He saw it in his eyes. That's why, when he chose him to be the rock, he did not do it for his strength, but for his heart. A heart capable of breaking. Peter didn't understand it yet, but soon he would discover that true love is not measured by the promises we make, but by the tears we shed when we fail to keep them. Jerusalem received them with a strange air. The crowd shouted, "Hosanna!" and waved palm branches as Jesus entered riding on a donkey. Peter walked behind him, his chest swelling with pride and his heart full of hope. In that ovation, he saw proof that everything they had lived had been worth it. At last, the people were recognizing his master. And in his mind, he already imagined the day when Jesus would rule with justice and power. But as Jesus moved through the crowd, he wept. Peter didn't understand why. He couldn't see the shadow stretching behind that joy. The days in Jerusalem were intense. Arguments with the Pharisees, hateful stares in the temples, whispers of betrayal in the streets. Peter felt the tension, yet his faith kept him steady. In every gesture, in every word of the Master, he saw the calmness of one who has already accepted his fate. And that unsettled him. He wanted to believe everything would end well, that God would never allow such a thing. But at night, when the group rested, Peter would watch Jesus in silence and notice something in his face he had never seen before. A serene sadness, a light that seemed to be saying farewell. It was during the Last Supper that everything began to twist. The air was heavy, as if time itself had stopped. Jesus took the bread, broke it, and said, "This is my body which is given for you." Peter watched him, not understanding. Then came the cup. "This is my blood, poured out for many." Jesus' voice was steady, but his eyes were full of compassion. Peter felt a knot in his throat. "Lord, what are you saying? That can't happen to you." Jesus looked at him tenderly and replied, "Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you all like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." Peter didn't fully understand those words. All he felt was a mix of pride and defiance. He struck the table with his hand and exclaimed, "Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison, and even to death." Silence fell over the table. Jesus didn't interrupt him right away. He simply looked at him, with that sadness only known by those who already see what is to come. Then he said softly, slowly, "Peter, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter's heart shrank, not because he doubted Jesus, but because he couldn't accept that such words could be true. "Never, Lord. Even if everyone abandons you, I won't." Jesus didn't reply. He simply placed his hand over Peter's, like a father caressing a child who does not yet know what awaits him. That night, the air in Jerusalem stood still. Outside, shadows moved in silence, and the distant echo of footsteps on the stone announced that something was about to break. Peter didn't know it yet, but his greatest trial had already begun. While the Master spoke of love, he spoke of courage. While Jesus prepared to be handed over, Peter kept dreaming of being the one to defend him. And in that difference, between surrender and strength, his downfall was hidden. Night fell over Gethsemane like a heavy veil. The stars seemed to hide behind the clouds, and the air smelled of iron, of damp earth, and of farewell. Jesus walked a few steps ahead in silence. Peter followed him, along with John and James, not fully understanding what was happening. There was something in the Master's face he had never seen before. A pain so human, it seemed divine. "My soul is sorrowful, even to death," said Jesus, and his words pierced Peter's chest. He wanted to respond, but didn't know what to say. He simply nodded as Jesus walked a few steps away to pray. The wind barely moved, and the olive trees creaked as if listening to some ancient secret. Peter sat on the ground, his back against a trunk. He was tired. The days in Jerusalem had been hard, full of tension and fear. But more than physical fatigue, what weighed on him was confusion. He closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't want to sleep, only to rest. He remembered the words spoken at supper, the sadness in Jesus' voice when he said, "One of you will betray me." He looked at his companions asleep and told himself it wouldn't be him. He would never betray him. If necessary, he would die right there. But sleep overcame him, and in that instant of weakness the heavens trembled. Jesus returned and found them sleeping. "Could you not watch with me even 1 hour?" His voice carried no anger, only sorrow. Peter jumped up ashamed. "Lord, I'm sorry. I was tired." Jesus looked at him and said, "Watch and pray, that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Those words engraved themselves in Peter's mind, though he did not yet grasp their meaning. For Peter believed his spirit was strong. He did not yet know the weakness of his flesh. He sat back down, trying to stay awake. But the weight of silence was too heavy. His body grew heavier, his eyes closed. Again and again he drifted into sleep, while only a few steps away, the Son of God was sweating blood in his prayer. Suddenly, a noise cut through the night. Torches, hurried footsteps, the clinking of swords. Judas appeared at the head of the group. Peter leapt to his feet, his heart burning with anger and fear. "Traitor!" he shouted as the soldiers advanced toward Jesus. One of them reached out to seize him, and Peter, without thinking, drew his sword and struck, cutting off the ear of the high priest's servant. Chaos erupted, shouts, confusion, fire, and shadows. "Enough!" The voice of Jesus pierced the darkness. He bent down, touched the wounded man, and healed him. Then he looked at Peter. He didn't need to say a word. That look alone was enough for Peter to understand that he had acted out of fear, not faith. Slowly he lowered his weapon. His hands were trembling. The soldiers took Jesus away. Peter wanted to follow, but the others fled. The garden was left empty. Silence returned, heavier than before. On the ground, the metal of the sword reflected the moon, a reminder of his failure. That night, Peter believed he had defended him. He did not know that in truth, he had already begun to deny him. The air of Jerusalem was cold that night. Peter walked among the shadows, following from afar the procession of torches that moved away with Jesus as a prisoner. Shouts echoed through the narrow streets, and the metallic sound of weapons mingled with murmurs of hatred. From the rooftops, some watched in curiosity. Others closed their windows. Peter moved forward with his heart in his throat. He didn't know what to do. He only knew he couldn't abandon him. When they reached the courtyard of the high priest, he hid among the crowd. From there, he could see the inside of the courtyard, lit by fire. Jesus stood in silence before his accusers. They spat on him, struck him, insulted him. Peter clenched his fists. He wanted to step forward, to shout, to do something, but fear stopped him. The sword he had wielded hours earlier was no longer in his hand. Only guilt remained, beating within him. The fire in the middle of the courtyard crackled, sending sparks that lit the tense faces of the servants and guards. Peter moved closer to warm his hands. His breath mingled with the smoke. No one seemed to notice him. He tried to stay unnoticed, but inside him there was a storm. He heard the voices accusing the master, the lies, the shouts, and each word felt like a blow. Then a young woman looked at him curiously. "You were with him too," she said, pointing her finger. Peter flinched. All eyes turned to him. "I don't know him," he answered quickly, his voice trembling. No one pressed further. For a moment he thought he was safe, but his chest tightened. His own voice had sounded strange, as if it didn't belong to him. Minutes later, another man recognized him. "You're one of his disciples too." Peter denied it again, this time louder. "I am not." Fear began to consume him. He didn't know if he was speaking to the others or trying to convince himself. The words escaped his lips, driven by terror. Time thickened. Every spark from the fire felt like an accusation. Peter looked at Jesus from afar, just a shadow among shadows, as they pushed and struck him. He wanted to move, but his legs wouldn't respond. Then a third voice, more certain, rose above the crowd. "Of course you were with him. You're a Galilean. Your accent gives you away." Peter felt the ground collapse beneath his feet. "I don't know him. I don't know what you're talking about," he shouted. The echo of his voice faded into the air, and in that precise instant, the crow of a rooster broke the silence. A simple, ordinary sound, yet in that moment, it rang like judgment. Peter lifted his eyes. Jesus turned his head. Their eyes met through the crowd, only for a brief instant. There was no reproach in that gaze, only infinite sorrow. And in that exchange of looks, Peter understood everything. The weight of his words, his fear, his betrayal. He felt his heart shatter. He ran out of the courtyard, stumbling over the wet stones. The rooster crowed again in the distance, as dawn painted the sky a mournful gray. Peter fell to his knees and wept. He wept as he had never wept before. Not for being weak, but because he had discovered what it truly means to love, and still fail. Tears ran down his face as the sun rose over Jerusalem. Inside him, something was breaking, and something new was being born. For the first time, Peter truly knew his own soul. And in the silence of that morning, he understood that the man who had promised to die for his Lord had died in another way. The dawn after that night brought no comfort. The streets of Jerusalem were still, wrapped in a heavy silence that weighed more than the noise of the day before. Peter wandered aimlessly, head down, unable to look at anyone. In his mind, a single image replayed endlessly. The eyes of Jesus hearing him deny him. That look haunted him like a shadow. It was not a look of anger, but of wounded love. and that was what destroyed him the most. He took refuge in a house where some of the disciples were hiding. No one spoke. The air smelled of fear. Outside, soldiers patrolled the streets, and the rumors of the crucifixion spread like fire. Peter sat in a corner, trembling. He didn't want to eat. He didn't want to sleep. All he wished was to go back, to change his words, to erase that night. But time does not turn back, and guilt does not forgive. I denied him. 3 times. He said it in a low voice, as if by speaking it he might learn to accept it. But the tears kept returning. He remembered every word, every silence, every step he took as he fled the courtyard. He asked himself why. Why couldn't he keep his promise? Why had fear weighed more than love? At some point that day, the rumors were confirmed. Jesus had been condemned, crucified, dead. Peter covered his face with his hands. He felt the air escape his chest. The whole world stopped. That voice which had calmed the sea, that hand which had lifted him from the waters, was gone. And he, who had said, "I will follow you to the death," hadn't even been able to follow him to the cross. Night fell, and the silence became unbearable. Some wept, others sat motionless, staring at nothing. Peter went out into the courtyard and looked up at the sky. There were no stars, only darkness. And in the midst of that darkness, he felt for the first time the distance of God. It wasn't anger. It was emptiness, an emptiness that hurt more than any wound. He knelt down and pressed his hands into the earth. "Forgive me," he whispered. "I didn't know how to love you. I didn't know how to believe." His tears soaked the dust. The echo of his voice faded into the night. But deep within his soul, something began to stir. An invisible thread. A spark of hope so small it could barely be seen, yet enough to keep him alive. Because true love, the kind that comes from above, is not broken by betrayal. It simply waits in silence until the heart dares to return. Peter didn't know it yet, but that silence that hurt so deeply was the prelude to the miracle. The place where forgiveness had already begun to take shape. That Sunday began when no one was expecting it. The sun had not yet risen when a frantic knocking broke the silence of the house. Peter jumped to his feet. When he opened the door, he found Mary Magdalene, breathless, her eyes filled with tears and her face burning with a mix of fear and hope. "The tomb is empty," she cried. "They've moved the stone! His body isn't there!" Peter's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, he thought it must be a mistake, just another rumor. But Mary's voice didn't tremble with sorrow. It carried something else, a faith reborn. Without a word, Peter ran out. John followed. The morning wind struck their faces as they raced through the narrow streets of Jerusalem. No one spoke. Only the echo of their footsteps and their labored breathing filled the air. The path to the garden was both short and eternal. When they arrived, the tomb stood open. The stone rolled aside. Peter stopped at the entrance, trembling. For a moment, he didn't dare to go in. The memory hurt too much, but something inside him urged him forward. He bent down and entered the dim light. The air was still. On the ground lay the linen cloths, folded, the shroud set apart, carefully placed. No body, no blood, only silence. A different silence, bright, almost sacred. Peter stood motionless, not knowing what to think. Part of him wanted to believe. Part of him was afraid to. If it was true, if he had really risen, what did that mean for him? The one who had denied him. Could he ever look into his eyes again? He stepped out of the tomb slowly, his face flushed with confusion. John looked at him, speechless. No one understood what was happening, but deep within Peter's chest, something began to break. Not from pain, but from hope. It was as if the very air whispered that the story was not over yet. They returned to the place where the others were hiding. Everyone spoke at once, voices tangled in fear and joy. Some said that Mary had seen the Lord, that he had spoken to her. Peter listened in silence, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. If it was true, if Jesus was alive, then perhaps there was forgiveness. Perhaps there was still time. That night he couldn't sleep. When he closed his eyes, he saw the empty tomb, the folded linens, the still air. He didn't understand the miracle, but he knew that something inside him was awakening. The guilt was still there, but now it had a crack through which light was entering. Peter couldn't imagine it yet, but that very light was calling him. Not with reproach, but with love. The same love that had looked at him when he fell was now seeking him out to help him rise again. The days that followed were a mixture of silence and waiting. Some of the disciples decided to return north, to the lake where it had all begun. Peter went with them. They didn't know what else to do, only that they couldn't remain still. The words about the resurrection felt distant, impossible, And Peter, though he wanted to believe, still carried a weight that bent his soul. That night, the lake was calm. The stars reflected on the water like sleeping embers. Peter took the helm. He didn't speak much. Since the last time he had held those nets, he felt like a different man. Before, he had fished to live. Now he cast the nets to forget. But forgetfulness never comes when the heart hasn't been healed. Hours passed, and they caught nothing. Fatigue mixed with frustration. The wind was cold. Then, as dawn began to break on the horizon, a voice called from the shore. "Children, do you have anything to eat?" Peter looked up, irritated at first, not recognizing who was speaking. "Nothing," he replied. The voice came again, calm and clear. "Cast the net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." Peter hesitated for a moment, but obeyed. As he threw the net, it filled with fish. So many it almost tore apart. The water boiled with life. In that instant, John looked at him and said, "It is the Lord." Peter froze. Then, without thinking, he threw himself into the water and swam toward the shore. Each stroke was a mix of hope and fear. He wanted to see him, but dreaded his gaze. When he arrived, a fire was already burning on the sand. Jesus was there, sitting by it, a fish roasting on the coals and bread at his side. Everything was so simple, so ordinary, it felt unreal. Peter stopped, dripping wet, unsure what to say. Jesus looked at him and smiled, that familiar smile that heals without words. "Come and eat." No one dared to speak. They ate in silence. The crackle of the fire and the murmur of the water were the only sounds. Peter couldn't lift his eyes. Each spark of the fire reminded him of that other night. The other fire, the one beside which he had denied him. After they had eaten, Jesus looked at him and spoke his name gently. "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?" Peter swallowed hard. "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus nodded softly. "Feed my lambs," a second time. "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" Peter felt his heart tighten. "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." "Tend my sheep." And a third time, the most painful and the most beautiful. "Simon, do you love me?" Peter lowered his head, his eyes filling with tears. "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus reached out his hand and touched his shoulder. He said nothing more. He didn't need to. In those 3 questions, he had erased the 3 denials. In that moment, Peter understood that he was not only forgiven, he was restored. The Master wasn't asking for explanations, only love. The wind blew across the lake, just as it had the day he first called him. But now, the water was not witness to an impulsive promise, but to a heart transformed. Peter was no longer the fisherman who doubted, nor the apostle who denied. He was a new man, born from forgiveness. Jesus stood, looked toward the horizon, and said, "Follow me." And Peter followed him once more, without fear. This time, not because he believed himself strong, but because he had learned that true strength lies in the one who allows himself to be forgiven. Since that day by the lake, everything changed. Peter walked differently. He no longer spoke with the voice of impulse, but with the calm of one who has known both fragility and grace. Where once there was pride, now there was compassion. And where there had only been fear, now dwelled a faith tempered by fire. The forgiveness of Jesus had not made him forget his fall. It had made him understand it. Every tear shed had become the foundation of his new strength. He returned to the other disciples, but he was no longer just one of them. They looked at him with respect, not because he was perfect, but because they all saw in him the living story of what love can rebuild. Peter spoke of the Master with a tenderness that disarmed. He didn't use grand words. He spoke from the wound that had been healed. He said that the kingdom was not a throne, but an open table. That true power did not rule, it served. On the day of Pentecost, when the Spirit descended upon them like wind and fire, Peter was the first to stand. The same man who had trembled before a servant girl in the courtyard now spoke before multitudes without fear. His voice rang through the streets of Jerusalem, firm and aflame. "This Jesus, whom you crucified, God has raised up, and of this we are all witnesses." Those words did not come from pride, but from gratitude. Peter knew he was not speaking out of merit, but out of mercy. As time passed, his name spread. He healed the sick, guided communities, and comforted those who doubted. But within him, he never forgot the sound of the rooster. He carried it engraved, not as guilt, but as a reminder. Whenever someone came to him for advice, he would think of that night and say, "Do not be afraid to fall. God does not seek the perfect, but those who have the courage to rise again." And so, the fisherman who once denied love became the living testimony of that same love. His words, his life, his changed gaze were the echo of a story that did not speak of failure, but of forgiveness. if you've come this far, perhaps you too know what it means to fall, to doubt, or to be afraid. Perhaps you've also felt that fire that never goes out, that voice calling you to return. If so, leave a word in the comments. Faith, not for me, but for you. Because every time you write it, you'll be remembering the same truth Peter learned, that even after the deepest falls, faith can rise again. The years passed, and the fire of the Spirit kept burning within him. Peter traveled through cities, spoke before multitudes, and wherever he went, people did not see a sage or a hero. They saw a man who had learned to love without conditions. His voice had become gentler, yet firmer. When he preached, he didn't rely on the strength of argument, but on the truth of his testimony. He told his story with humility, never hiding his fall. He would say, "I denied him, I betrayed him, but he did not deny me." And every time he spoke those words, many found hope within their own wounds. Peter had changed. He no longer sought recognition or power. The only thing he desired was to fulfill the promise Jesus had made to him by the lake. "Feed my sheep." And that is what he did. Day after day, along the dusty roads of the empire, comforting the poor, strengthening the weak, reminding everyone that love does not impose itself, it gives itself. Sometimes on quiet nights, he would look at the stars and remember those days by the lake, the voice that had first called his name. He would smile. He had walked through fear, denial, tears, and forgiveness. And now he understood something he never could before. That faith is not about never falling, but about letting God lift you up each time you do. In time, Rome became his new horizon. There, his name would be written into history, not for greatness, but for sacrifice. He knew the path would lead him to the same end his master had faced. And far from fearing it, he accepted it with serenity. He would tell those close to him, "Love is not proven by words, but by surrender. And if my life can serve to show that he lives, then I do not fear to die." He had found peace, a peace that does not come from circumstances, but from a reconciled soul. His face, aged by sun and years, still carried the same light as that fisherman who once walked upon the water. But now that light was deeper, gentler, the light of one who has been forgiven and has learned to forgive. Peter did not know when or how the end would come, but every morning, upon waking, he would repeat in silence the same words Jesus had said to him after his fall, "Follow me." And so he did. Step by step, without looking back, the man who once fled from the fire was now ready to embrace it. Rome burned with the light of the empire, but in its shadows another flame was being kindled, the flame of those who followed Christ. Peter had come there, guided by faith and by a certainty that no longer needed miracles. He lived among his brothers, sharing bread and word, knowing that the days of peace were few. Persecution spread, soldiers searched homes, and every gathering was a risk. But Peter was not afraid. He had lost fear the day he was forgiven. One night, the brothers begged him to flee. "The Lord needs you alive," they said. Peter agreed to leave, and as he stepped through the city gate, the sky was lit by a red dawn. He walked in silence, until, on the road, he saw him, Jesus, standing, serene, walking in the opposite direction, toward Rome. Peter stopped, trembling. "Lord, where are you going?" The answer was gentle and terrible. "I'm going to Rome, to be crucified again." Then Peter understood. His heart burned within him. He turned around and walked back to the city without a word. He knew what he had to do, not as the man who once promised without understanding, but as one who had learned the language of love. To the end, they arrested him soon after. He did not defend himself. He did not ask for mercy. To those who insulted him, he looked with compassion. To those who struck him, he offered his face without hatred. There was no pride in him, only peace. When they told him he would be crucified, he smiled. But with humility, he added, "I am not worthy to die as my Lord did. Crucify me head downward." The day of his death, the sky over Rome was gray. The wind swept through the hills, and in the distance echoed the footsteps of soldiers. They led him to the place of execution. There, Peter knelt before the inverted cross. He touched the wood and closed his eyes. He did not think of pain, nor of fear, nor of death. He thought of the lake, of the fire beside Jesus, of the voice that had called him and forgiven him, and he smiled. When the hammer fell and the world turned to silence, his last prayer was a whisper. He did not ask to be remembered. He only murmured, "Lord, thank you for letting me love you to the end." And in that moment, in the heart of the most powerful empire on earth, a man crucified upside down became the symbol of the highest thing a human soul can reach: humility. They say that sacred stories do not end with death, but with the seed they leave behind. Peter fell 3 times, and 3 times he was lifted up. He denied, he wept, he loved, and in the end, he understood that faith is not about never failing, but about always returning to love. His life was a spiral, one that began in fear and ended in surrender. The fisherman from the lake became the rock, not because of his strength, but because of his weakness embraced by God. And every time someone feels far away, unworthy or broken, the echo of his story returns, like the crowing of that rooster at dawn, a reminder that there is always another chance. Because the same Jesus who looked at Peter that night still looks at you with the same eyes, not to judge you, but to lift you up. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, so that every week we can continue discovering together that even our falls can become the beginning of a miracle. Because in the end, we are all Peter, and every time we rise again, heaven begins again with us.